Hey everybody, and welcome back to another Max Velocity weather forecast. And in today's forecast, we'll be breaking down a large pattern change that'll be impacting the United States over the next several days, increasing the heat wave in a large chunk of the United States. Meanwhile, other areas will be dealing with severe storms capable of damaging winds, large hail, and perhaps even a few tornadoes. I'll give you the latest breakdown on everything that you need to know in this forecast, but let's first begin with what's happening across the United States today. We'll first begin with the central and southern plains. That is where we currently have some shower and storm activity ongoing this morning, and this is our next area to watch for some severe weather. Would be across the central plains. Up here is a precursor to the storms that we're going to see this afternoon. So there are some showers and storms ongoing in parts of Nebraska. Not really any crazy severe storms this morning, but that coverage will increase this afternoon with the threat of all modes of severe weather, and we'll talk about more on that later in this forecast. Now back over into the northeast, you might notice this massive area of showers and storms. That's actually from what we just saw in the Midwest yesterday with that small-scale tornado outbreak that brought several tornadoes to areas near Chicago and in the Chicago suburbs. That is now moving off to the east, and guess what? More tornadoes are likely ahead today. There's going to be another chance for at least another possibly small-scale tornado outbreak, but it should remain somewhat more conditional, and we should only see maybe a couple tornadoes at most today. But there will be at least a couple up there, up into the northeast, and possibly even into southern Canada, so this will definitely be something to watch for as well. Down in areas like the southeast United States, there's a massive flooding concern ongoing actually in Mississippi. We've been seeing tons of rainfall in central Mississippi. You might notice here in that very small area that I circled, that is where we are seeing some record-breaking rainfall. Tons of rain is falling right now, stationary rainfall, and that's going to create an increased risk of flash flooding. We'll also talk about more on this as well later in this forecast. Now let's talk more about that strange weather pattern that'll be coming to the United States, and it's going to be kind of an interesting one because we're going to have currently a zonal jet stream, which is allowing more for just straight winds from west to east in the upper levels, which is actually allowing for more of like a train of storms almost that's been kind of rolling through the United States. You might notice from yesterday, for example, we had that mesoscale convective vortex that went through the Midwest. That's what posed that tornado risk, but now the jet stream is going to change a little bit over the next few days. But let's kind of first mention the features with the one that we have. We have a massive ridge down in the southwest United States. That's our heat dome. We are seeing at the surface a high pressure system back down in parts of the Gulf of Mexico, which is actually pulling tons of moisture out of the Gulf of Mexico. But overall, this other high pressure system over into the southwest United States is keeping areas very hot, and it's being super stagnant as well. I mean, we're really not seeing any changes in the weather in the southwest United States in the foreseeable future because of this heat dome. And then as we go throughout the next several days, this jet stream will change a lot because we're right now in a zonal jet stream, which is really just a flat jet stream here across the United States. But then this is going to get more curvature, and this is what we call a meridional jet stream, and that's basically going to change our weather pattern entirely because you'll notice down in the southwest United States, that is where we still have that dominant ridge, but it's going to be a bit more in a shifted area. So we're going to have actually heat go a bit further off to the north and northwest. In addition to this, we'll have a trough start to deepen and strengthen in the upper levels back up in northern United States and as well as Canada. So this is going to become very interesting as we go into the weekend and early next week, because this trough back up here that's in the upper levels could actually increase the risk for severe weather back in areas in the Midwest, possibly the Ohio Valley and the northeast United States on the later half of the weekend. But a lot of things need to happen for us to actually see some sort of severe weather outbreak. But I'm just saying there's at least a chance there for some severe weather. It could be a severe weather outbreak at some point down the road, but for right now, again, it's a little bit far out because things could obviously change. Once we go into early next week, things start to shift a bit more. So we'll have back in the southwest United States that massive heat dome. Again, it's not moving anytime soon. I've mentioned this in several forecasts now. It's really not moving much at all, but it's going to continue to sit there. That's going to continue to bring record-breaking heat to some areas. By the way, Death Valley is likely to cross 130 degrees at some point this weekend. That would be one of the hottest temperatures ever recorded on Earth. The warmest temperature ever recorded on Earth was back in 1913 in Death Valley at 134 degrees. So we are going to be, again, possibly getting close to challenging that record-breaking temperature back down in Death Valley. Then the trough back up in the northeast United States, or really into Canada, just north of Michigan, that's going to continue to move off to the east. It could still pose a threat for some showers and storms, maybe even a little bit of severe weather as well to parts of the northeast. And then once we go in later into the week, that heat dome does not really move at all. If anything, it actually moves further to the east, which will continue to bring the threat for some heat illness as well. So make sure you're limiting your time outdoors if you have respiratory issues and that sort of stuff. It's going to be pretty dangerous to be outside for a elongated amount of time just due to how hot it will be in some of these areas. But with this high pressure system moving further off to the east, that could actually lead to the humidity dropping a bit for some parts of the southern plains. So that might be some good news there, and that would lower the feel-like temperatures outdoors as well. So some good news there, but overall, a pretty brutal weather pattern is coming here to the United States. So definitely make sure you're staying safe out there. Again, the heat is not really going anywhere. This is the temperature anomalies to give you an idea of where it will actually be hot and where it'll be a bit cooler over the next few days. And once we get closer to the weekend, that heat just continues in the southern United States. It really goes nowhere. Even parts of the Midwest will be slightly above average. But again, notice back up in Canada, that's where we have that massive trough that's brewing right now. And this could actually bring some nice cooler weather to areas in the northern plains. And the Climate Prediction Center also agrees with that they are forecasting below average temperatures for some parts of the northern United States as we go throughout the late weekend and into early next week. You'll notice here by Monday, cooler weather starts to usher into areas in the Midwest. So a lot of nice relief there for those that really want it. And then once we get closer to Wednesday into Thursday of the next week, which is pretty far out from now, the heat dome will start to intensify across parts of the southern plains. So definitely not something that we want to see there. As we were just talking about Death Valley, I did want to show you that this is the current forecasted high temperatures for Saturday in parts of Southern California. Look how hot it's going to get here in Death Valley. Current forecast from the HR model is around 125 degrees. The National Weather Service is forecasting near 130 degrees for Sunday. This is Saturday, so it's going to be very hot there regardless, and all across parts of California, very hot weather is coming. Make sure that you are limiting your outdoor time, especially if you have respiratory issues in those areas. Now let's talk more about the severe weather potential for the next several days, and we're going to begin with today. Currently, we're on tossing trampolines on trees Thursday, so there's going to be a chance for some tossing trampolines today. We currently have two large slight risks of severe weather, one of which goes from Minneapolis all the way back through areas in the Texas Panhandle. We also have another slight risk of severe weather back into the Northeast, and that's associated again with that mesoscale convective vortex that we saw yesterday in parts of the Midwest that brought that threat for tornadoes, and that's going to again happen today. But luckily, it seems like that tornado risk will be a bit lower, maybe a slightly higher damaging wind potential. Now, the main concern for today is going to be damaging winds and large hail. Here's your large hail outlook for today. So back over in the high plains and central plains, that's where we could see some hailstones upwards of baseball-sized hail, maybe even a couple storms with apple-sized hail would not be out of the question. So basically, the hatched area means you have a better chance of seeing hail above the diameter of 2 inches. So that's a big concern over that direction. And then back into the Northeast, that's where we might see some sporadic hail, and as well as the Ohio Valley, by the way, there could be a couple storms that produce some sporadic hail, upwards of maybe golf ball sized hail, but overall that threat remains a bit lower there. The tornado risk is not too concerning today, but we do have to monitor it very closely, especially in the Northeast, because there is an increased risk still for tornadoes. Similar to yesterday, but we shouldn't see any strong, long track tornadoes like we saw yesterday. It should be more of a brief week sort of threat, but definitely make sure you're staying weather aware if you're back up into the Northeast, especially in eastern New York. That is where we could see potentially a couple of tornadoes, maybe even a few tornadoes are possible. I wouldn't rule out an isolated strong tornado, but the risk is definitely a bit lower than yesterday since the shear will be a little bit lesser there as well. And then back over into the high plains and central plains, that's where there is a very conditional but very low tornado risk. It's going to be a very low chance overall. We might see an isolated tornado, maybe two, but the threat should remain low there. Now let's talk more about the timing. Begin with the central plains. Storms will fire up this afternoon, really around about 3-4 o'clock in eastern Colorado. These will move off to the east, and they'll be posing large hail, especially with those initial cells. By about 7 o'clock or so, some storms up in Nebraska could also be posing that threat. And then back over here, that's where we'll be watching for other storm activity. And eventually getting closer to around 8-9 o'clock, we'll be watching for maybe 1 or 2 discrete cells to be left over in western Kansas. Those will still be producing that threat for large to very large hail, maybe some damaging winds, and then maybe a complex of storms through Nebraska as we go throughout the late evening. But that should start to weaken as daylight heating expires and as we go into the overnight hours. We might see another area of complex of storms actually also blow up back down in southeast Kansas, but severe weather would be a pretty low chance out of that. Just isolated damaging winds is the main concern there. For those in the Northeast, we'll be watching for storms during the afternoon to fire up 1-2 o'clock. That's when we'll be watching storms rolling through New York. By around 3 to 4 o'clock, storms will be approaching areas near Albany and eventually eastern New York, and going closer to about 5 o'clock or so, those storms will be crossing into Vermont, which Vermont does not need the rainfall, but there will be a chance for severe weather there with damaging winds and isolated large hail, and perhaps a brief tornado. Eventually going closer to 8 to 9 o'clock, those storms roll through Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and eventually off the coast, and weakening out after midnight. So severe weather not really expected after 10 o'clock, but there might be a couple of storms still left over, with some rumbles of thunder and obviously lightning associated with those as well. And as we head into Flying Fences Friday, there is currently a risk of severe weather in the central plains and as well as back through areas near Illinois. This is mainly just for some isolated damaging winds and large hail. I wouldn't rule out that this risk goes a little bit larger, so we might see the slight risk expand a bit, but it will not probably go into an enhanced risk. It's mostly just large hail and damaging winds. Also a small marginal threat on the east coast and the mid-Atlantic for isolated damaging winds and large hail. There's your wind threat right now. Both the same thing. No tornado risk right now from the Storm Prediction Center. I do expect the tornado risk to stay fairly low across this region. Here's your timing as we go into Flying Fences Friday. Storms will fire up during the afternoon in western Kansas. Those will be ones to watch for. That's where we actually could see an extension of the slight risk of severe weather, depending on how this evolves on the future radars. And then once we go closer to the evening hours, storms will start to move through areas in Oklahoma with mainly damaging winds and large hail, and eventually going into the overnight hours. Some showers and storms will remain, but overall the activity will remain pretty isolated. But the shower and storm activity will remain a bit more numerous. It just won't be severe for the most part. Going into Saturday, there's a marginal threat of severe weather across the Ohio Valley and Michigan. That is where we're watching for isolated damaging winds and large hail. And then once we go into Sunday, things could start to expand a bit in the northeast and east coast. But as of right now, things are still a little more uncertain due to the weather pattern that is still evolving right now. Last thing I want to mention, the flash flooding is really concerning right now in Mississippi. We do have a moderate risk for flash flooding today, especially for the excessive rainfall outlook. And that's where we're watching for some really excessive rainfall. The rainfall totals could very well get upwards of almost 10 inches of rain when it's all said and done by the end of today. So really concerning stuff there. If you know anybody in this area, west of Tuscaloosa and north of Meridian, make sure that they're all right, because there's some extreme flooding that's starting to begin over there with a flash flood emergency that was issued earlier this morning. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure to hit the like button down below and subscribe if you've not already.